We have discussed a lot of fault lines, and right now we're going to explore a different potential solution. One of the reason all of us are here in this particular group is that we have the privilege to be working with Seoul National University under the leadership of Professor Im and Professor Park on a research project supported by the Korean National Research Foundation, trying to study a different mode of governing AI, which is through standards. And one of the things that we're exploring, we've spent a lot of time talking about the Korean AI Act, to some extent about the EU AI Act. And this panel was going to explore an alternative solution, an approach to regulating AI that's not as much driven by governments, but rather by standard development organizations. And so with that, we'll start the conversation going, but as a matter of introduction, I'd like to start with you, Professor Hurwitz. What is a standard?
Thank you, Christopher. Thank you, Yong, and thank you, everyone, for sticking around. And I like how you have framed this question and this discussion as a potential solution, because I'm going to start by suggesting that there's a lot of confusion around the concept of standards, and in fact there are fault lines inherent in the concept of standards, because everyone talks about we need AI standards, we want AI standards, and most folks, I think, when they're talking about AI standards, they don't have a clear understanding of what a standard is. And that's because there are lots of different potential meanings of this concept. So I'll just briefly outline a couple of different categorizations of standards. So I'll try not to get into examples in the interest of time, but probably the most general categorization is formal versus informal standards. Formal standards, we all get together through some mechanism and say, this is how we're going to do something. Informal, we don't go through that process, but by some organic process, we come to a tacit agreement that this is how we're all going to conduct our industry, our behavior, our whatever. Another common categorization of standards is voluntary versus de jure, or mandatory versus de facto standards. And this deals with why people follow these standards. So voluntary standards, there might be competing alternate standards, there might be a standard setting organization or some group that comes and develops a standard and they put it out into the world. And you don't need to sign on to that. You can opt into the standard for whatever reason. Mandatory standards. You have to follow the standard as a condition of operating your business, operating in an industry. And then de facto standards, there is no mandatory requirement. There might not even be a defined standard out there, but we all happen to walk on the left side of the street or the right side of the street without rules saying that you need to do this. It's just how we do it. Under the category of de jure standards or mandatory standards, we can have subcategories. We can have explicit standards. So for instance, a law could say you have to drive a certain speed limit, or the Federal Communications Commission in the United States, they define a communications channel for the purposes of a cable television system at 6 megahertz. So that is what a channel on a cable television system needs to be, 6 megahertz. Other times it might be by reference. So again, in the United States, in most jurisdictions, you need to, if you're building a new building or doing electrical work, you have to follow some version of the National Electrical Code, and it's by reference that you need to do this. Some external organization defines what that is. So again, we have different categorizations. Another really important categorization, and I think this is possibly the most important for the discussion around artificial intelligence, is technical versus process versus compliance standards. So technical standards say, this is how you have to design your system. This is how you have to do red teaming. This is how you have to do security. These are the technical requirements for how you design or implement your system. We frequently see these with interoperability requirements, for instance. Process-based standards don't get into the technical elements. They say these are the steps that you need to go through when you're designing your system. These are the transparency obligations that you have to have. We're not going to tell you what information you need to put out there, but you need to do something. You need to do some amount of testing that you can certify. Then compliance standards. These are similar to process, but it's less about how you design your system. It's more about steps that you must go through that you can check off before you're allowed to operate. And we don't care what you're doing, we care that you're doing it. The last categorization that I'll put out there, which I think, again, we elide over frequently in these discussions, is the purpose of the standards. Is it to determine whether your system will be allowed to operate? That is it legal to use your system versus liability standards? How are we going to determine whether your system did something wrong when something goes wrong?
So it's a very complicated set of analysis, but I'll try to give you one very simple example, and I'm sort of holding my phone in my hand. Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi is a standard created by an organization called IEEE. It's a private organization, and it's a communication standard. It used to be the organizations like the International Telecommunications Union would create communication standards and mandate that governments would mandate that everyone use it that way. Adopt the standard and communicate in a particular way. But the most interesting thing about this phone is it has Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. And if you look at the old studies and the advocates of the day, they thought that Bluetooth would be this great technology that everyone would be using, and Wi-Fi would be this little tiny niche communication standard. And they were both created by private entities with multi-stakeholder participation. But it turns out Wi-Fi is the dominant standard, not because anyone told us to, but because we all voluntarily adopted it as users, as producers, and as a different modality. Instead of the government ordering everyone to do it a certain way, you allow multiple organizations to propose different standards, and then we see in the marketplace on a decentralized basis which one actually is adopted. And so what we see is different approaches technically and different compositions of how they're decided. And to a certain extent, there's a tendency to think of standards as this wonderful panacea. I mean, you hear this in certain areas, like in a lot of the areas I work in, they talk about public-private partnerships. We're supposed to think, that brings everyone together and solves all of our problems. But what we're discovering is just by calling something a public-private partnership doesn't really solve it. It depends on what kind of public-private partnership, how the decisions are made, how the voting is. So I know in a lot of discussions, we've devoted several years of our lives to studying how standards would work. But I guess the question is there something magic about standards if we just put it in this private decision-making and everything's just going to work out better? So I'm just looking at you, Nicholson. Well, should we just say, okay, by calling it a standard that solves all our problems, let's go home and AI will be perfect and wonderful, we don't have to worry about it?
Well, when you put it like that, obviously, yes, standards are magic. They will solve all of our problems. No, of course we don't think that. I think there are benefits to standards, and saying there's some benefit to saying here is a tool that can be flexibly used and where we could potentially have competition between different standards, and we can say, here is the expertise of industry combined with civil society, combined with academia, all coming together in the process to say what actually works, not what makes it through a lobbyist heavy lawmaking process once every several years. So there's a benefit to this flexibility, this collaborative effort. I think there's also a real risk that comes precisely from that kind of magical enablement of standards as this hooray, we're going to let the market and expertise solve it, which is, it's easy to fob off the process on standards with the assumption that we will get something real out of it. And it's easy to say, and I think here back to when you were moderating your earlier panel, where you said, there's been this big shift in the general rhetoric about AI from here we're going to regulate for risk to we're going to regulate for innovation. And one way you could say, let's regulate for innovation is to say, rather than having heavy-handed ex-ante regulation. Instead, we'll let industry develop standards to do the right thing. But that doesn't say anything about what the content of the standards is, and maybe those standards are great, really great at protecting privacy, and really wonderful about a need to ensure that there isn't discrimination and everyone is happy and everybody gets a pony. Or maybe we say, okay, like we're going to leave it to standards. Industry's going to do things. Industry says we get thought long and hard, and we have a code of conduct that says what would be great is if our prices let us make a lot of money. And we're going to call that the standard for privacy and consumer protection. There we go. And I think there's I'm obviously going too far, but I think there's a real risk that when we turn something over to a standards process, we imagine that that process will come out in a useful outcome that will serve the governance purposes we want, and it can easily be captured even more easily than legislation.
Well, it's interesting. We all see the benefits of standardizing things in some ways. For those of us who remember what it was like buying a printer before the USB cable came along, there were 13-pin pictures cables, there were 17-pin cables, there were all kinds of different things. And now we have a more uniform standard that we can get away with the same thing. But as you point out, many standards are useless. I mean, they're badly designed, and just because people can pick doesn't mean that we're actually going to create good ones. And so many of them languish, and it's not obvious just by having the standard there's anything magic about it. Now, Sancho, I want to talk to you. I know in our prior conversation preparing for this, we were talking about the role of standards and harmonization internationally. Because one of the issues we have is, well, if Korea has one approach, and Europe has one approach, and the US one approach, we don't understand this to be bad. How can this help us here, Sancho?
Yeah, the different regions have very different, agenda and goals. For example, the EU focuses on human rights protection as well as its digital single market strategy. And just as we discussed, the Trump administration's recent America's AI Action Plan, focuses on expanding America's AI capabilities along all AI stacks to allies and partners. And as for Korea, well, we are still wrestling on in which direction we should go, and there are a lot of internal discussions. But I think, amid such kind of local fragmentation and some kind of disagreement, I think the important thing is for us to have some minimum system of decentralized governance. I think that is closely related to the future of the Bletchley Declaration and the AI Safety Institute or Security Institute. And I think the original intent of Bletchley would have been to form a kind of decentralized governance based on international standards and interoperability, and based on that, rather than seeking some consensus, we admit that different standards can compete with each other too, and then probably based on the market mechanism or some more close cooperation, we can reach into a better and flexible future based on interoperability. So I think based on such kind of standard or interoperability, maybe probably you can address the problems of local fragmentation and then have better governance rather than centralized governance.
So, Young, if I may turn to you, in our conversations, we also talked about the timing of adoption of standards. So we have, how do standards work in a technology that's going through organic, dynamic change technologically? Are these a better approach? Are they a worse approach? Particularly compared to a legal approach, which is our major alternative.
So to put a positive spin on standards, like I'm secondly trying to follow in Nicholson's steps. If standards were to provide that additional flexibility and the capability evolved, unlike law, if that were the case, then standards would probably be an improvement on the current legal regime, because the current legal regime often it's difficult to amend, Then it's an adjudicated system. There's penalties, etc. And definitely everybody I think today is realizing that, okay, some things we have to rethink the law. I mean, there's parts that, there's gaps and all that. If standards could provide that sort of making law more of a living, breathing, evolving creature, and plus without the bureaucracy, without the adjudicators, voluntarily trying to strive for that, then maybe that's the panacea. The problem is that's not only not always the case, but probably not the case most of the time, right? And then that's something that we often really don't want from standards in certain cases. And to me, when regulators and legislators talk about standards today as part of the AI governance scheme, they're not thinking about an evolving, flexible document, but more of a, okay, this is it. Okay, I said the law, and this is the technical details. Stick with it, adhere to it. So if standards, if we could sort of reimagine standards at least related to AI or at least certain areas, and try to be creative, maybe even ask ChatGPT, and try to make some really, so be creative there and somehow move toward that flexibility. Definitely, there is some hope there. As of now, I think we're not there yet.
So if I can try to sum up, one of the things about legal approaches is that they mandate a particular technical approach into law. You have to do it this way. And one, you have to have faith that the government can correctly decide what that way is in the first instance. And what we discover is all the technical people, if we were that smart about technology, we'd all be on the beach sipping pina coladas and not having to work for a living. The answer is, I don't think anyone's that smart. We're constantly surprised. But the problem is, even if you get it right the first day, things change. And law changes slowly. At a minimum, there's a process, whether it's a regulatory process or a legislative process, and it's going to be constantly playing catch-up. The advantage of standards, private standards, is they're not mandated by law. If the technology changed where it didn't make sense for us to do it that way anymore, we can change without having to go through any process. So, right now, no one has to make equipment manufacturers put Wi-Fi in their phones. Why? Because we know we have a communication, we coordinate around one way to communicate, and we all voluntarily do it because it's in our best interest for all of us to be able to communicate with each other. If a new technology came along tomorrow that would do it the better way, there are no legal obstacles we have to jump through, and if the technology comes along, it'll be better. The problem is, we need good standards to do that, and there's nothing, and the process of making good standards is quite complicated. And so that's a fascinating problem here, because standards is about design, and right now we have a bunch of different actors competing to offer different standards for AI, and we have to figure out how they're going to work out. Now, I want to turn back to you on a different question, which is, you hear a lot about AI sovereignty these days, and I think particularly in Korea, this is a major part of the debate. I would love to, we started to have a conversation. What do you think the benefits are of AI sovereignty, and what do you think of the risks? I mean, you've seen both sides of this debate. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I'm going to talk in Korean for the benefit of them. So we're talking about sovereignty. So AI 주권 얘기하니까 우리나라 말이겠습니다. AI 주권이라는 말이 무조건 나쁘다, 좋다 말하기 어려울 것 같습니다. 어떻게 하느냐에 따라서 달라질 것 같은데 이렇게 생각해 보시면 좋을 것 같아요. 두 가지 측면이 있는 것 같습니다. 한 가지 측면은 통제, 컨트롤인 거죠. 그러니까 반드시 내가 소유자라는 그런 의미가 아니고 이거 내가 마음대로 할 수 있는 거죠. 그런 이제 측면이 하나가 서비스가 있고 다른 측면은 fish예요, fish. 그러니까 옷을 생각해 보면 내 거가 있고요. 남이 만든 것도 내 거일 수 있는 거죠. 내가 원하는 대로 할 수 있는. 그다음에 나한테 잘 맞는 옷이 있습니다. 남의 옷이라서 잘 맞을 수 있습니다. 그래서 이 두 가지 측면이 있는데 지금까지 수업원이나 여러 가지 정책적인 포인트들을 보면 많은 경우에 내 거에 많이 돼 있고요. 그러다 보니까 조금 좀 최고 난이더라도 95% 정도라도 이런 얘기를 자꾸 나오는 거죠. 근데 사실은 내 거이길 바라는 이유는 핏을 나한테 맞추기 위한 거예요. 남의 오시면 제가 이렇게 재단 못하는데 내 거니까 가서 수선도 하고 짧게 하고 쭉 피고 늘렸다 할 수 있는 거니까 그런 측면에서 컨트롤 생각해야 되는데 그게 결여되어 있는 게 문제고 그게 결여되어 있다면 그러면 AI 주권이 반드시 높진 않습니다. 그러니까 어떻게 될 거냐면 내 거이긴 한데 별로 핏이 안 맞고 그리고 내가 안 옷장에 그냥 걸려있는 옷이 돼버릴 거예요. 그게 이제 최악인 거죠. 그래서 한 가지 그냥 이걸 보여주는 것 중에 하나가 지금 성능에 대한 얘기가 많아요. 그것도 95%인 거죠. 그것도 약간 이상하긴 하지만 사실 현실적인 그런 목표라고 하더라도 그러면 그게 정말 AI 기본법을 준수할 95%일 건지 또는 정말 우리의 갬성과 우리의 원하는 윤리와 가치에 부합하는지에 대해서는 아무 얘기 없습니다. 95%면 된다는 거죠. 그게 과연 핏이 맞는 건지. 그래서 컨트롤을 말씀하실 때 그 목적이 핏에 있으면 좋은 주권인 거고요. 그게 아니면 과연 우리가 그런 주권이 필요한가? 라는 생각. 왜냐하면 제가 안 만들고 또는 제가 굳이 뭔가 이렇게 전혀 안 해도 저한테 잘 만들어 잘 입고 다니고요. 사람들이 칭찬도 하고 어떤 때는 그 옷으로 뭔가 장사하기도 하고 다 할 수 있거든요. 그러니까 그런 점을 좀 잘 생각하면 좋겠다. 그런 게 현재 논의에 너무 결여되어 있는 게 아닌가라는 생각을 합니다.
So that's a fascinating perspective. Nicholson.
I just wanted to follow up because I know that we split into 3 different panels, but there was a really fascinating presentation in Shilla 2, the AI agents and courts, about the idea of a Swiss federal digital kind of sovereignty model, where the idea was not just digital sovereignty, but also intellectual sovereignty, and the justification for that. What I found was really interesting is like, we want a large language model for the Swiss judicial system in particular, which is based on Swiss cases, Swiss logic, and if there are French language cases from France, that's not what we want to train this on because we want to keep this as a distinctly Swiss system. And so I think that really aligns with what Jan was just talking about fit. It's not just control, it's to the extent that these are models that are encoding values, encoded in language, and encoded in data, like there's a real value to saying those are going to be our values and our data and our way of life that we're putting into this kind of model as it becomes kind of replicated over time, over lots of people.
I could put this actually into the standards discussion. There is some recent research out that looks at the values embedded in large language models. And it finds, very unsurprisingly, most LLMs have been trained on primarily a canon of Western texts from particular Judeo-Christian backgrounds. And unsurprisingly, as a result, there are values embedded in them, and those are de facto standards. And that is uncovering a set of standard values within a certain canon of training data, and that may or may not be representative of the values that are relevant in Korea, in China, in other sovereign parts around the world. And there's, we can go back to the geopolitical discussion, there are certainly concerns about exporting certain values into other countries, into the supply chain, national security concerns here. And so the idea of AI sovereignty, it really touches on a lot of imported values, and in a real way, it comes back to this question of standards. I love the example of clothing. Without getting too personal here, we have 3 folks who live in the United States sitting on this side of this panel, and I think it's fair to say that our clothes are slightly looser fitting shall I say, than our Korean counterparts. There's something embedded in there that we don't necessarily think about that is a de facto representation of something that's very tangible about different cultures. And that is something that we need to be aware of as we're thinking in the technical context, in the political context, across all these domains.
So what Yong in this conversation is getting at is one of the things framing the discussion here is that there's an optimal amount of standardization. That is, if everyone wants the same thing, you can then standardize around one framework and you can serve everybody. But if what people want differs, and if that's the case, then having one big solution to everything isn't the right idea. But there's another problem with this. That's the demand side. It's the supply side. So we talk about AI sovereignty. Everyone would like, to create AI, you need not just data, but you need chips, everything. I'm sure every country would love to have its own chips, so they can be completely independent and sovereign, supply chain reliability, and money. There are 193 United Nations recognized countries. We will not have 193 chip manufacturers. Why? There's not enough volume. There's a scale economy issue. So the flip side of customization is it's costly. And if there's not enough demand for your particular version, you're not going to get it. And so there's this trade-off that constantly happens. When I think about it in this context, you have to think about, in fact, where you can do that and how it's going to work out and whether it's worth it. You have something to say.
Just one quick question. One quick point. That's a wonderful thought, because if we create our own sovereign model, it's not going to have a market within Korea. I mean, if that's the market, it's not going to be good enough. It's just too damn I shouldn't say that, but it's just too expensive to create a 95% frontier model just for a Korean market. We have to export it. If you want to export it, then it can't be Korean pure values. Sorry. The fit has to fit the US. And I guess one saving grace here is that K-pop is the theme. Maybe our fit is the global fit, right? And so, but without thinking of that and saying that, okay, we're going to go with the K-fit, we feel that our values, not only pop, but our values will be the K standard going ahead, then we have a viable business case. If not, you do not want to do this. So that's another thing that really works.
And I think this is something Koreans understand well, because if you look at the revolution of the 1960s, it was a shift to an export promotion model. That the way that Korea uplifted itself and has become the miracle that the whole world recognizes is because they didn't confine themselves to a domestic market and really looked outside. Songcho, you look like you want to say something.
Yeah, I think, for the fascinating point that Christopher raised, I think we should also consider some shifting trends, because until last year, everybody talked about foundation model, and it was a very important agenda for everybody to have their own premise LLM on their asset. But now, a more important thing is to maintain access to state-of-the-art LLMs and then exercise our domain-specific knowledge and national idea to orchestrate different LLMs and then connect them to effectuate some agent model or other kinds of augmented LLMs. So now the trend is actually changing, and I think our agenda of sovereign AI doesn't necessarily conflict with our another important agenda to play our own role in the global supply chain, especially led by the United States and our continued access to state-of-the-art LLM models.
Well, we're over time, and I wanted to say that I would like to claim that we've answered all the questions and given an encyclical solution to all these problems. But that's not feasible. But the good news is we're going to do CyberCon again next year, so we'll leave something else for us to talk about in the future. With that, please join me in thanking the panelists for an excellent discussion.
마치려고 하는데요. 항상 사이버콘 매해 마칠 때 감사 말씀을 몇 차례 드립니다. 우선 우리 패널리스트들에게 Our wonderful panelists, thank you so much. 이렇게 멀리 외국에서 다 또는 국내에서 바쁘신 가운데 오셔서 정말 즐거운 지적인 그 다음에 창의적인 향연을 한 것 같고요. 그 다음에 두 번째 그 감사는 여러분들입니다. 이렇게 많은 성원을 이렇게 오셔가지고 또 저희에게 힘도 많이 되시고 또 같이 이 논의에 참여해 주셔서 깊이 감사드리고요. 그 다음에 가장 중요하게는 저기 뒤에 박스 안에 계신 통역사님들과 저 뒤에 있는 테크니컬 스태프와 특히 이 모든 것이 작가님들, 연구원들, 학생들, 제자들 말 없이는 불가능했을 겁니다. 그 감사의 말씀 특별히 드리고 그 크리스토퍼의 얘기 그 말씀하신 대로 사이버폰 2026 다시 찾아뵙겠습니다. 여러분 감사합니다.